Hello, thanks for watching. My name's Wendy Walls. I'm a lecturer in landscape architecture design here at the Melbourne School of Design. I'm living and working on Wurundjeri land, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And as somebody working in a contemporary design school, I've been quite interested in the ways that interdisciplinarity is emerging as a really important idea in how we come together and how we teach. And that idea that we need to research, practice through multiple frameworks, it's been a huge influence on the contemporary design school. And there's a substantial and growing body of research to support that, particularly around classroom strategies. But there are also some real tensions that underlie this idea of how research manifests in on-the-ground teaching, how new methods play out, how they're received by students, and how much impact they have. And so this brief piece of research, it's a small step towards exploring some of these tensions, where they come from and where they influence design pedagogy. So some of this work comes from my PhD, which was about climate design and landscape architecture. But as I'm sure you know, many of our current challenges are really tied up in this bigger question of how we come together as different people, different disciplines and interests. So general ideas of unifying or combining knowledge have existed for thousands of years. Aristotle combined biology with cosmology, but way before that, First Nations people crafted systems like this. So this image is Budgebim in Western Victoria. It's over 6,000 years old. It's eel traps, it's agriculture, farming, it's water engineering, it's architectural design. It's also part of an economic system. And looking from here, that idea of trying to separate discrete branches of knowledge from what is clearly an interconnected system seems strange. However, in the North American and European world in the late 19th century, science and industry, it developed more into dedicated research areas, which carved out new professional expertise. So the modern universities started to offer emerging specialized fields of study, things like economics in 1885, sociology in 1905, alongside more precise distinctions in the natural sciences, like botany specializing in nomenclature. And while these branches had always existed discretely, they were now being taught as their own units within the university. In design education, that shift towards recognized expertise, it's best known through the Bauhaus School, which developed in Germany in the early 1900s. And this is where craftsmanship was paired with industry, which was elevating design from an artisan trade to an educated discipline with a professional design degree. This is one of the founders, Walter Gropius. But at this point, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was that distinct push towards specializations, which was quickly critiqued by people like Charles Snow, who wrote a well-known paper called The Two Cultures Gap in 1959. And there were also other people in sociology as well as education reform, like John Dewey, who was arguing for general civic education. And then later with modernism in the 60s and 70s, and postmodernism, that further questioning of the constructs of acceptable or discrete fields of knowledge. And you get seminal work like Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and ideas of co-creation start to emerge. From this time, ideas or concepts like correlating, integrating, unifying, and transmitting all start to be used to describe this bringing together different kinds of knowledges. In the Western university, that general concept of interdisciplinarity, it quickly expanded out of educational research into more comprehensive social theories for examining these relationships and hierarchies of working across multiple perspectives. We fast forward in time, and there are now very clear definitions of these models and distinctions between things like multi or participatory or interdisciplinarity. So this diagram is just one example. What becomes interesting for us is how these terms are still often used interchangeably, particularly in contemporary design schools and teaching. And in part, that interplay and confusion of definitions and meaning, it's been shaped by some of the background power structures and hierarchies within schools themselves. So the big modern design schools, places like MIT and Harvard, they're often cited as the beginning of Western design education. So this was the late 1800s before other influences like the Bauhaus. And these were initially based on the French Beaux-Arts model of teaching. This was a strict and very competitive environment where students are mastering specialized skills. So this is an example here of students practicing painting and drawing. However, into the early 20th century, those influential North American schools, which were being affected by the education reform, ideas of European modernism and new American pragmatism, and much of that thinking was being interrogated around interdisciplinarity, which pushed towards more integrated teaching models. So this is also where the Bauhaus returns as a major influence. In particular, Walter Gropius came to North America and he was appointed to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. And here he worked with Harvard's Dean of Architecture to modernize that architectural curriculum. They abolished the Beaux-Arts approach and fused the departments of architecture, landscape architecture, regional and urban planning into the Graduate School of Design. So this was a major turning point in North American design education. However, following that Bauhaus philosophy, these ideas of merging and fusion, they occur under the framing of architecture. That idea that the architect becomes a generalist. And in North America, at least, and probably more broadly, this lineage of design education as a multidisciplinary practice of architecture, it's had a lasting impact. So by way of fast forwarding us in time again, here are some of my lovely students at work. And obviously over the last half century, there are more and more examples of expanded or combined design education and teaching. And there are many notable smaller colleges and more experimental institutions globally that have been more radical than those big institutes. However, that demand for interdisciplinarity, it's still been a huge factor in shaping the contemporary design school. And when we look to the big institutions, even with that established body of work from sociology in defining meaning, we still see that confusion about what we mean by interdisciplinary design education. So I've pulled 4 examples here about how different schools describe themselves. Harvard has an ever-expanding disciplinary breadth. RMIT here in Australia have a rich community of interdisciplinary collaboration. The Bartlett are both multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary faculty. That's from a 2022 statement. And MIT, which is a school of architecture and planning, organize architecture into disciplines to model architecture's unique integration of diverse modes. So there are plenty of other examples of this. Singapore is future-focused, interdisciplinary. Most of us are familiar with this mix of ambition / marketing statement around how disciplines actually come together. However, within many of these kind of strategy statements, there is this assumption that there will be natural cooperation and partnerships between the built environment and design disciplines, simply because they're housed in the same faculty or that they work on related subject matter. At the other end of this spectrum, there's been an uptick in research at a practical level, how to teach different student groups together and maximize the benefit of multiple disciplinary perspectives. So enabling interdisciplinarity requires really specific strategies and tactics which can bridge interests. So the second part of this paper looks at 3 distinct pedagogical examples. And these can be loosely defined as immersion, melting pots, and mentors. And each of these offers a little bit of insight into how design education has approached and addressed some of these tensions of how schools themselves are set up. So immersion is a strategy where students are taken from one discipline and exposed to other ways of thinking. And scholarship has argued for immersion as key to effective shifts in consciousness, particularly through direct experiences and attention. The most common example, of course, being immersive language learning. And in interdisciplinary immersion, students are asked to use methodologies from outside of their home or core discipline. So, for example, students from Singapore University of Technology and Design have worked around concepts of designettes, which are brief encounters with other ways of thinking. This here in the image is a photo of students in Melbourne University using that strategy of a brief encounter as a module of experimentation. And while that brief encounter or designette fits as an immersive strategy, students still return to their core disciplines to master their own specializations. And research has shown that when students undertake immersive learning strategies, they have a greater appreciation for other knowledges, but not necessarily gain deeper or more complex strategies for synthesizing knowledge. This tends to be done through the second strategy, which is melting pots. So melting pots describes a mixing of disciplinary interest in a shared territory. So probably closer to what we would call transdisciplinary. And these are intended to neutrally blend disciplines. And often this technique gets used in subjects in the early stages of a degree, where aligned disciplines like architecture and engineering or landscape are seen as grappling with the same content. Now, drawing from research in this area, which has assessed this kind of subject teaching, has found that whilst teaching teams might agree to a melting pot approach, in practice, individual tutors have a major influence. So if it's an engineering tutor, they tend to teach through verbal or step-by-step processes, whereas architecture or design tend to be more visual and comfortable with abstraction. And so those responders have found that who you are taught by creates a really strong role model effect within the melting pot, and students tend to gravitate towards disciplinary sides rather than developing skills in integrating different perspectives. And this signals the third area, which is mentors. So mentorship, it's harder to fit into subject or course structures. However, both peer mentoring and academic mentoring are recognized as important strategies for enriching interdisciplinary learning. Mentors expose students to new disciplinary territory through shared experiences, which are often more informal channels. And for some students, this can be useful when grappling with new territory. So, for example, the academic advising program at the University of Melbourne, it matches students with academics within their faculty, but not just within their chosen major. And this offers students access to academics outside of their subject choices, as well as advice on curricular and co-curricular activities. And that program has reported success in broadening students' disciplinary views and also supporting the development of more well-rounded students. However, the success is often dependent on how engaged that student already is in their programs. So I'll really quickly conclude by reflecting on how these three typological examples of discrete pedagogy sit against this larger background of interdisciplinarity in design education and in the institution. And I think there are three sort of key challenges we can point to. The first one is to acknowledge the force of the institutional setting in steering how interdisciplinarity is practiced. So while classroom-based or extracurricular tactics themselves may be innovative, they often sit in this context of the institution, which really influences where students come from and where they go next. And even examples of disciplinary pairings or exposure, often they will be isolated where students must return to a core discipline to master primary knowledge, which is to also say individual disciplines are really valuable. And for students approaching new or unfamiliar territory, the positive attributes do need to be made clear. So to acknowledge discrete disciplinary value. And where we've seen exposure to disciplinary perspectives through mentors to develop a wider awareness or bigger worldview, often this needs to be supported with more rigorous integration of ideas in order for students to value alternate positions. So as the case of the melting pots revealed, the effect of the program can at times be to highlight difference and encourage students to pick a side. And these only become tensions when attempting to hybridize knowledge. As scholars in social sciences and education have highlighted, bringing disciplines together, it can exacerbate competition and provoke conflict. So these reflections are questions on power as much as activity. And while there's a host of research about teaching diverse groups, very few of these address the dynamics of power or authority, which exist in institutions and classroom settings. That ongoing assumption of easy collaboration has been described by other researchers as a fantasy of mutuality that ignores the dynamics of organizational hierarchies and power. So in moving interdisciplinary forward in our built environment design schools, we cannot assume neutrality. We must move beyond general descriptions towards tactics that do address dynamics of power. Thank you for listening. There's a quick list of research there. Enjoy.